least the light won't be reflecting off my glasses. Huh? I should get a voice synthesizer now, a vocoder. What?
I have
really?
one.
You have a vocoder? Yeah. Why do you have a vocoder?
Well, I don't know what a vocoder, but it changes your voice to like a theater. Is that what?
Okay.
Since if you're a spy and you call somebody you don't want them to know who you are.
Oh. No, we just like her.
She could tell us about it, but she'd have to kill us afterwards, right?
Yeah, the first thing you think we're going to be is a spy.
That's why we'd pick you. That's why we'd pick you. You got to blend. Michelle, can we begin?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon and welcome to the third class in church history for the 2018 School for the Diaconate in the Diocese of Fond du Lac. If you're having difficulty seeing me because of the light balance on this, you can just pretend that I'm in the Witness Protection Program. But if you recall, in our first session, we talked about the world into which Jesus was born. What were the preconditions in the world at the time into which the Messiah came? And then we, in our second class, talked about sort of the rise of the imperial church. Once Christianity stopped being a persecuted sect on the margins and started becoming more and more mainstream, what was the process involved there? What was actually going on in the persecution by the Roman Empire, or persecutions, I should say? So here we are now, and we are to the point where we have what we would call an institutional church. And so the first thing we're going to look at is the rise of the early papacy. Now, part of this is going to be based on what are called the Petrine texts. The claim to the primacy of the See of Peter, successors to St. Peter, has been based on Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 to 19, Luke chapter 22, verses 31 to 32, and John chapter 21, verses 15 to 17. Now, what do we have here? First of all, if we look at the Matthean text, this is the famous text where Jesus, after Peter has acclaimed him to be the Messiah, says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." If you look at the debates that have swirled around this pretty much since the Protestant Reformation, if you're a Roman Catholic, you'd say this is pretty well straightforward, that Peter is the rock, and it is therefore his successors upon whom the church will be focused. If you are a Protestant of a particular persuasion, you'll sit there and say, well, wait a minute, no. The rock is Peter's faith, his confession of Jesus. Now, if you go back and look at the Greek in Matthew, it's pretty clear in terms of the agreement of subjects and objects and verbs that Jesus is speaking about Peter as the rock. The question becomes then for non-Roman Catholics on both the Eastern Orthodox side of things and on the Protestant side of things, what do you do with that? And the first thing we see is that we have this thing called ARSIC. Anybody know what ARSIC stands for? It's the Anglican Roman Catholic Interfaith Commission. And it was established in the 1960s. In the 1960s, Archbishop Runcie, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Pope Paul VI got together. It was the first time there was a meeting between an Anglican archbishop, particularly the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Pope. And a dialogue ensued. This is post-Vatican II. Vatican II conference has ended, and or I should say the council. At Vatican II, non-Catholic churches were invited. And so, for example, there were Anglican observers at Vatican II. It's like détente. And what ends up happening, amongst other things, is that Pope Paul VI and Archbishop Runcie exchange rings. And so for the rest of his papacy, Paul VI wore the ring of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And until Paul VI died, Archbishop Runcie wore the Pope's ring. But he returned it to the Vatican when the Pope died because normally when a Pope dies, his ring is smashed. Because this, of course, is a seal for a papal document such as a bull or encyclical. ARSIC was formed. ARSIC still exists. Commission. ARSIC still exists and periodically will come out with agreed texts that say, here are the things between the Anglican Communion and the Roman Catholic Church that we agree on. Now, there's actually a similar body for the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran churches. And so you get these agreed statements, you know, here's where we're going to still argue, but here are the things we can agree on. One of the ARSIC texts from 1977 looks at the question of Petrine supremacy or Petrine primacy. And the statement ARSIC releases is, the weight attached in the past to the Petrine texts is greater than they can bear. However, Rome did become the center of the church, and this was because of Christ's will. I think it's fair to say that any fair statement within the Anglican Communion, unless you're just rabidly anti-Catholic, and there are some of those, would be that the lack of communion between the Anglican Communion and the Roman Catholic Church is a wound in the body of Christ. We would all agree on that. The question becomes, what do we do about it? And that's where we disagree. Now, I've given you actually a hyperlink down there to where you can find the long quotation here. And you can, go Google ARSIC and see all the things we've agreed on. You can get, like a 50-page document on what we agree on the Virgin Mary, for example. What we agree on communion, what we agree on biblical authority. Here we have Rome's prominence being associated with the deaths of Peter and Paul, who are both martyred, if you'll recall, from last month's class, in the mid-60s. And so when Nero has the first persecution of Christians in the city of Rome, about the year 66, 67, this is when both Peter and Paul are martyred. This is why, to this day, we would, the Roman Catholic Church would claim that the relics are in Rome. The importance of the Bishop of Rome, therefore, starts early. But recall, of course, that when Peter and Paul are martyred, there are no church buildings. And so if we were, looking at this from a forensic perspective and saying, is there a chain of custody in the evidence, we would have to cross-examine the witnesses, let's put it that way. But since we're not trying to do this at a forensic level, but to say, how do things start out, we can definitely say that there is an early focus in Rome. But if you recall from last month's discussion of the development of the creeds, there's also, of course, an early focus in the East. And what we're going to see is a developing tension between the Greek language confessions of faith and how these get rendered into Latin. You'll recall as well that in the early centuries of the church, churches in Greek, even in the West, and as late as the late 3rd, early 4th century, even in the city of Rome, you would find a lot of the church service would be in Greek. Anybody want to remember what our legacy of that is in our current service? Well, we're in Lent. We still say Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. That goes back to the beginning here. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. You'll note in the R6 statement here that there is an agreement that Christ's will for his church was to put Peter in charge here, but that communion with the Bishop of Rome does not imply submission to an authority which would stifle the distinctive features of the local churches. The purpose of the episcopal function of the Bishop of Rome is to promote Christian fellowship and faithfulness to the teaching of the apostles. The theological interpretation of this primacy and the administrative structures through which it has been exercised have varied considerably throughout the centuries. Now, that's an understatement, right? And that's committee speak, right? You water things down to the point where you can agree on something. You don't say very much. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, there were significant moves between the Anglican Communion, the Church of Rome, and the Eastern Orthodox churches to come closer together. That has been basically derailed by changes in the Western Anglican churches. And so between the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church in Canada, a few others, there have been things which Rome and the Eastern churches consider to be theological innovations, such as women in holy orders, such as the ordination of non-celibate gay people as priests. That has caused that sort of reconciliation process to kind of go sideways a little bit. And there have been not very active discussions for some time. Now, if we go on, did I get the right slide now? Yes, okay. If we go on, we see that when we're talking about the early papacy, we're going to go back to those church fathers we quoted at the end of our last class to say, what do they kind of stand for? And we start out here with Clement I, who is a pope. His letter, Clement I, that should be the other way around. If you were to cite the letter, it'd be 1 Clement rather than Clement I. In his letter written to the church in Greece, he is already indicating in the year 96 that Rome regards herself as possessing authority to intervene in the affairs of other Christian communities. That's why he's intervening in Greece and saying, here's what the issues are as I see them and what to do about them. You'll recall that we also talked about Ignatius of Antioch as another church father, and how he is the origin in writing of the monarchical episcopacy, the idea of the bishop as ruler, and the idea that the church exists when gathered with the bishop. Now here Ignatius writes in his letter to the Romans, Rome ranks first in love, being true to Christ's law and stamped with the Father's name. Notable is what here about Ignatius, writing about Rome? Where's he writing from? Antioch. He's writing from the Eastern Church. He's in what is now Syria. So early on, even some authorities in the Eastern Church are recognizing a primacy in Rome. Does this mean that this is a supremacy, or is this a first among equals? Now, this is something we struggle with in the Anglican Communion in the last 20 years particularly, because the issue becomes, if you look at the sub-Saharan African provinces of the Anglican Communion, they really are not in agreement with a lot of things that have happened in the West, right? And some of them have put some distance between themselves and the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the question becomes, is the Archbishop of Canterbury a first among equals, what we call primus inter pares, amongst all of the archbishops in the Anglican Communion, or does the Archbishop of Canterbury have any authority over the archbishops in the other provinces? And the Anglican polity is that the Archbishop of Canterbury is a first among equals. He's not a pope. He cannot order another archbishop to do anything. That confuses a lot of Episcopalians because we tend to think of the Archbishop of Canterbury as sort of an Anglican pope. Rome, early on, is, in the eyes of other archbishops, a first among equals, but in her own eyes has supremacy. What we're going to see is that supremacy sort of comes to be the primary view in the West. We see Irenaeus writing towards the end of the 2nd century here, from what is now southern France in Lyon. All churches must be in harmony with Rome because of Roman preeminence established by Peter and Paul and long recognized. Now, Irenaeus, in writing his letter against the heresies, is not sitting there and saying, this is because of this text in Matthew, or this is because of this text in John, etc. He's saying, because of what happened, because of Peter and Paul being brought to Rome and exercising authority there, this is why we recognize Rome as having authority. Incidentally, why is it significant that this happens in Rome in the ancient world?
The Romans persecuted Jesus. Well, Pilate was Roman.
Right. But the significance here is Rome's the center of the world. It's the world capital. I mean, it's kind of like sitting there in New York and thinking that the rest of the country is flyover country, right? You view yourself as the center anyway and act like you're the center. The question is, do other people start recognizing that? Moving on, right behind Tertullian, or right behind Irenaeus, Tertullian in the year 200 now specifically cites the Matthean text as a proof text for Petrine supremacy. What do I mean when I say a proof text?
Before it had been suggested that the Petrine text, it was a suggestion that Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and here it's more, it's solidified. More people are in agreement, and they would argue that because of it.
Yeah, well, that's how proof texts arise, but when I use the word or the phrase proof text, I'm being a little technical here. And this is something that really is more of a fundamentalist approach, not that I'm accusing Tertullian of that you sit there and you say, here's what the Bible says, and you pull out a verse. That's called proof texting. So if we think of those passages, let's go back to women's ordination. We think of the passages in Paul where he says, do not allow a woman to speak in church. If you're against women's ordination, you're going to pull one of those out and say, aha, see, the Bible says you can't do this. That's what I mean by proof texting. So Tertullian is the first one to take Matthew 16, 18 to 19 here and say, this is what Scripture says. This is why the Bishop of Rome is preeminent. Then we get Cyprian of Carthage, mid-3rd century. He who does not hold this unity of Peter, does he believe he holds the faith? He who deserts the chair of Peter, on whom the church was founded, is he in the church? Now notice also that Cyprian is referring to the unity of the Catholic Church. Recall that the word Catholic is just the Greek word for universal. There is no schism yet between East and West, so they're just talking about the church, the way today we say church capital C. Leslie.
I mean, we know that Paul has spent some time in Rome
Fair statement, because Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles and Peter is more the apostle to the Jews. But he ends up in Rome. And so we see in Paul's letter, well, if we go back, we see that when Paul's writing to the church in Rome, he's writing in the mid to late 50s from Corinth. And if we go back to the year 49, the Emperor Claudius has expelled Jews from Rome, in part because he says they're disputing over this figure Christus. They're always, having a problem. And so he kicks the Jews out of Rome. That's how Paul runs into Aquila and Prisca in Corinth. Then when Nero ascends the throne, 63, 64, sometime around then, he's like good Nero to start with, and he allows the Jews to come back to Rome. That's the occasion of Paul writing the letter to churches that are now encountering a different problem. With the Jews expelled, the faith in Rome has become a more Gentile population. Now the Jews are coming back. There's an argument as to who's doing what and how it should be done. And that's the occasion of Paul writing. So in the absence of the Jews in Rome, the question becomes, was Peter kicked out? And there's no biblical record of that. So it's entirely possible that with the Jews kicked out of Rome by Claudius, Peter is there and evangelizing Gentiles. We do know that he is present at the first experience of the Holy Spirit by Gentiles, when in the 10th chapter of Acts, the Holy Spirit comes upon the centurion Cornelius and his household. So Peter, his first experience of a Gentile being baptized by the Holy Spirit, no less, and then Peter goes ahead and baptizes the household himself, is of a Roman soldier. And we can really only speculate about this, but it's entirely plausible to say Peter's in Rome doing stuff. Then Paul shows up. We then get, in the mid-3rd century as well, Origen. And he makes the Protestant argument that the church is founded on the rock of faith. Now, if you go back and look at the writings of Origen, you'll find that throughout the history of the Western Church, he's sort of in favor and out of favor at various times. You can find pronunciations in about the time of the Protestant Reformation where Origen is considered to be a heretic. And certainly his biblical interpretation is rather more modern than patristic. But he's the first one here who basically is saying, no, this is not about Peter. This is about Peter's faith, and Peter happens to be the one chosen by God for that. But the question is, do we share that faith? Do we confess that faith? Where we end up, though, is a doctrine of papal primacy. And beginning in the late 4th century, the doctrine of primacy is advanced by the popes themselves. The foundation of the Roman Church is attributed to Peter alone, and the apostle is accounted the first bishop of Rome. So they're saying it happened that way, and not saying too much about Paul other than that he wrote a letter to the Romans. Why would you do that, leaving aside whether this is true or not? Because we cannot really establish that. Why would you do that if you're a bishop of Rome? Right, you're consolidating power. You're saying this is the focus and we're the center of the world and this is how it works. Particularly because the center of the empire is starting to shift. And we're starting to see the emperor's court move to Constantinople. This is a threat to Rome. We're starting to see as well that in the West, the seat of power is in places like Milan and Ravenna. So of course you're going to sit there in Rome and say, hey, it's about us, right? Let's go on from there. Any other questions or comments before we go on? Well, let's look at some of the early popes and see how they played a role in the development of the papacy as we've come to know it. We start out with Pope Damasus I. And he's notable for a couple things. One of the things that we don't have in here is he's the one who commissions Jerome to translate the Bible into Latin. And so Jerome does this from both the Hebrew and the Greek, and we end up with what becomes the primary Western Bible for the next 1,600 years, the Vulgate. Why is it called the Vulgate? Because vulgaris in Latin, we're talking about the common tongue, vulgar tongue. He is the first Roman bishop to appropriate the title apostolic to the Roman see. He makes use of the majestic plural, we. He addresses other bishops as sons rather than as brothers. He asserts primacy not based on conciliar decisions, but upon the Lord's promise to Peter. In 378, the imperial government recognizes Rome as the court of appeal for the Western Episcopate. Where's the court of appeal for the Eastern Episcopate? It's the emperor. The emperor in the East considers himself to have authority on a lot of things that authority is not recognized in the West. Then we get Leo I, otherwise known as Leo the Great. He's the first pope to adopt the old pagan title Pontifex Maximus. Now, what does that mean? Dale, you're our Latinist. Do you want to play with that?
Well, it's the greatest pontiff.
Right, and pontifex, the pontiff here literally means bridge. And so, bridge between this world and the divine. Maximus being greatest. So, here we have, thank you, here we have the Pope saying he is the supreme bridge between the realm of this world and the realm of the divine world. Now, if those of you who are in formation to perhaps be ordained deacons, does this make you Pontifex Minimis? Because what is one of the roles of a deacon?
Serve the bishop.
Well, first you serve the bishop, but you are also the primary bridge between the community around the church and the church. You are to, in effect, interpret the community to the church and interpret the church to the community. You're the ones who are supposed to recognize when Lazarus is lying at the gate and point it out to the rest of the church. So this idea of being a bridge hasn't gone away in the church, but if you start calling yourself Pontifex Maximus, there'll probably be an issue with the ordination process. Leo, however, is the first, or the principal founder of the medieval papacy, emphasizing rule and principality. Now, let's look at what's happening background-wise here. This is not just a theological development, and it's not just a power grab with Leo saying, let's, be a monarch. Who does Leo have to deal with besides the emperor? The barbarians. He ends up having to negotiate with Attila the Hun and with Genseric the Vandal, both in the same year. Rome is sacked in the year 455. There are pagan armies coming through. It's important to be a figure of power. Now, the Pope does not yet have, specific territorial claims and an army, but he is the power seat in the West. The imperial government has not prevented pagan invasions. So you're seeing a power shift going on because of what's happening in world politics and the migration of peoples. Incidentally, when you talk about pagan invasions, there's always, or barbarians, Just a real quick aside. What does barbarian mean in Greek? Because it's a Greek word. It means people who don't speak Greek. So there's no sort of specific judgment about behavior there, although obviously if you don't speak Greek, you're not one of us, right? So we've got this image in our minds generally of barbarian invasions being huge hordes and armies coming in and things of that sort. There are certainly significant military clashes. But by and large, what happens is what we're seeing in the Mediterranean today, a migration of peoples. All those rafts coming across the Mediterranean, all those boats coming across the Mediterranean from North Africa to Europe, same deal. And leaving aside any judgment you might have on that, once you get that many people settling in your country changes. This is what's happening in Western Europe. The people are coming out of the steppes of Central Asia and moving into Europe across the Danube River, and it's changing Europe. There's pushback. The imperial government tries to push back. Then there's open warfare, and that's when people like Genseric the Vandal and Attila the Hun show up. And they do act like quote-unquote barbarians in that they like to steal stuff and burn stuff, right? So it's important to Leo and to the church to assert power, because the imperial power is failing. Recall, we've talked in earlier classes about how the church basically in the West becomes the heir to the empire, which is why the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church bears such a close resemblance to the Institutes of Justinian, to codified Roman law. And, I'm kind of jealous of the Roman Catholic Church because, they got this cool, long, catechism with everything defined. There's a very systematic way of doing things in Roman canon law. There's a very systematic way of doing things in the catechism that we lack in the Anglican Communion. Now, I'll probably get myself in trouble with somebody out there, but I keep the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church in my office because it's a quick, easy reference. For 99% of the issues we're going to have to come up with an answer, you can find it there. And then say, well, what's a little bit different here for Anglicanism or something like that? But this is a spiritual power struggle going on in the context of a geopolitical power structure. We're going to see that throughout the history of the church. We then get to Pope Gelasius I. He develops a theory of church-state relations. The emperor is to submit to the church in spiritual matters. The pope has the prerogative to ratify church councils and enforce or uphold their decisions. He is the first pope to be greeted at the Roman Synod in 495 as the Vicar of Christ. What does vicar mean? Vicarius, standing in the place of another. And so a vicar stands in the place of the bishop. It means the parish or the congregation hasn't called a priest in charge or a rector. And the priest, who is the vicar, has been assigned there by the bishop. Well, this is the same thing. Now, if you're calling yourself the Vicar of Christ, that's a fairly, expansive claim. We get Gregory the Great, servant of the servants of God. He argues that all churches are subject to the Bishop of Rome as Peter's successor. He protests the adoption of the title Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. He reorganizes the patrimony of Peter. These are the lands actually held by the Holy See, and lays the foundations for the papal state. He focuses a lot on missionary activity and the extension of papal authority north of the Alps. This is going to be important for us as Anglicans because here's where we get the mission to England, where St. Augustine of Canterbury is sent by Gregory to England in the year 587. So you can see there's power being consolidated here at the same time that imperial power is diminishing in the West. Moving on. What are the factors here in the rise of the early papacy? Apostolic foundation. It's important that Peter was there, right? The first seat of the Roman Empire. The sole patriarchal or even apostolic see in the West. In the East we have what? Constantinople, Antioch. We're going to end up with a couple more as time goes forward, but we have more than one. We have papal leadership. God blesses his church with some very able leaders in this time period. When you look at Leo and Gregory and Damasus, and these people are very, very gifted. We also get appeals to Rome for guidance and judgment. If you recall, there was a dispute over the See of Carthage because of the persecutions. There were people sitting there that had not been killed, and so the question was, are they out of the church or in the church? And what does the emperor do with that? He sends it to Rome to be adjudicated. So there is an imperial recognition of Roman authority in the West. Now, I've given you the arms of the papacy here. Let's just deconstruct them a little bit here. The crossed keys symbolize the keys of Simon Peter. The keys are gold and silver to represent the power of loosing and binding. The triple crown symbolizes the triple power of the Pope as Father of Kings, Governor of the world, and Vicar of Christ. The gold cross on the globe surmounting the tiara symbolizes the sovereignty of Christ. All of us in the room are old enough to remember a pope wearing a triple tiara. The last one to do so was Paul VI. The popes since Paul VI have not used that really cool hat. Maybe it's just too heavy. I don't know. But and there has been no particular move to try to bring it back. You can read into that whatever you will. I'm sure there is some genuine effort at ecumenism to say post-Vatican II. Given the symbolism of the triple tiara, maybe it's not appropriate. Now, if we go to slide 5 here, we're going to see something in parallel happening with the rise of the papacy, and that's the rise of monasticism. And we're also going to see specific Celtic missions in the north, which is going to be of concern to us as heirs in Anglicanism. When we talk about monasticism, let's first distinguish two different types. One is what we call eremitical or eremitical monasticism. This means you're a hermit. And the prototype of this is Antony of Egypt. The second is cenobitic monasticism. This means you're living together in a community. You become known as a monastery, right? This is St. Pachomius. He's also in Egypt. So monasticism arises first in Egypt and spreads east first. You'll note, if you look at the lifespans of the two men here, that living in community, he lives to be 56, and that living by himself, he lives to be 105. You can draw whatever conclusions you want from that. The cenobitic model, the community model, becomes the dominant model in the West. In the East, for a couple centuries, you're going to see more hermits. Again, this might be how organizing principles work differently between the Latin language and the Greek language. Same way as we saw that the disputes in the Creed were partly linguistic. These are two different ways of thinking. We see that there is an abbey established in Tours in the 4th century. There's actually one earlier than that near Arles, established by St. Martin and St. Denis. The principal figure we're going to focus on, though, is Benedict of Nursia, Saint Benedict. He founds the Benedictine order about the year 500, and Monte Cassino is founded about 529, the principal mother house of the Benedictine orders. And up until this time, there is very wide variation in how you are a monk, depending on which house you live in, right? There are extremes that can be ascetical extremes, beyond hair shirts and whipping your back or starving yourself. There can be extremes like living on a pillar in the desert. Benedict says, let's regulate this. And the word for rule in Latin is regula. That's where we get regulating things from. So we get the Rule of Benedict. It's 73 chapters long. It remains the principal regulation for most monasteries in the world today, whether they are Catholic or Anglican. And even some of the Eastern Orthodox pay a lot of attention to Benedict here, although they also pay a lot of attention to Saint Seraphim. This is really influential because it's a moderate path between individual zeal and formulaic institutionalism. The precept of the Rule of Benedict is pray and work, ora et labora. The motto is peace. Monasteries become self-sustaining economic units and centers of learning. Now, when we think of history in the West, and we start looking at the 6th century here, what do we tend to think of? What do we call the early medieval times or the late classical times, that sort of area between the two? We call them the Dark Ages, right? And literally things are kind of like falling apart. There is no imperial power that's effective. Individual kingdoms have not been able to consolidate their own power. You've got kind of basic warlords running around. You still have barbarian migration going on. There are still, various imperial attempts to establish order. But already by the time Benedict is founding Monte Cassino, we are basically 2 centuries past the withdrawal of the Roman army from England. Things have gone south in the West, right? And so when you look at an ancient monastery, what does it look like architecturally? Looks like a fortress. And it is a fortress. This is also why part of the Rule of Benedict is when a traveler arrives, what do? Take him in, feed him, provide hospitality. If he's in holy orders, allow him to function in holy orders. Because these are the little tiny bright spots on any kind of travel where there is relative safety and food and things of that sort. The Roman roads are still pretty much around. They're very well built. A lot of them have survived into our day. They're not being well maintained in this time period, but it's still possible to travel. But you don't have the Roman army to really protect you, and so travel is much more dangerous now. You have to travel, with an armed retinue, basically. Once you get to an abbey, you're safe. You've entered a fortress. But that reinforces the mentality within monasticism that you are setting yourself aside from the world. Let's be careful about that. Monks and nuns do not withdraw from the world. They're very much engaged in the world in prayer, lifting up the rest of us constantly. But physically they have withdrawn, and based on what rule they are under, they've withdrawn from other forms of human community. That's going to tend to let you see yourself as separated a little bit. And if you become one of the economic engines of development, it starts looking different in terms of how things are going to develop. Now, this is before the feudal world arises, right? We don't yet have formal feudalism of going up through, serf to master to lord to, duke to whatever. What's that going to require? What really gives rise to feudalism? A technological change. What arises in the West in the 9th century is the stirrup. Before that, if you are on horseback, what can you do in terms of fighting? You go quickly between places, dismount, and fight with a sword. Once you put stirrups on a horse, the horse now becomes part of the weapons system. And you can use a lance, and the weight of the horse and the rider is behind it. So you can break up groups of people on the ground. This is a revolution in military technology. The net result is everybody wants horses, and they gain power because of how many horses they have. This changes how farming happens. The other thing that happens is oxen are used for plowing, and they are bound with a particular type of harness that compresses their carotid artery. So they're very inefficient. Once somebody figures out how to harness oxen differently and how to use plow horses for plowing, there's a revolution in food production. But to do this, you need to do what? Enclose space to farm it. Whole different series of military struggles are going to arise on that basis. And it's going to come back to the stirrup. The stirrup is an invention in the steppes of Central Asia. How it gets to the West is not entirely clear. You can find whole doctoral dissertations on this. But once it gets to the West, it revolutionizes Western society because it changes how military power is deployed. Mounted knights become the armored warfare of their day. You can break through a line of infantry with a tank. At the same time that monasteries are becoming self-sustaining economic units, they become centers for learning. These are the only literate people kind of left in the West, right? And you get all the scriptorum monks who are sitting there and copying texts. This is why when we go back through all of the ancient and early medieval texts to look at, is this really what's said in the Bible? There's actually some chain of custody here. Now, if we go back to Monte Cassino, most of that gets wiped out in 1944, right? Because it commands the key pass in the Gothic line of the Wehrmacht that's trying to keep the American and English and New Zealand armies from advancing up the Italian peninsula. And so the Germans heavily fortify Monte Cassino. The Allied response is to bomb it repeatedly with aircraft and to shell it repeatedly. There's a pitched battle that goes on for a very long time, and Monte Cassino is basically reduced to dust. It has been rebuilt. Kind of looks the same, but it obviously doesn't have a lot of the stuff it had before getting flattened by a whole bunch of the 15th Air Force and a whole bunch of artillery. And the Germans were pretty good at dynamiting things to keep people at bay as well. Once we have monks and monasteries as centers of learning, we get the ability to send missionaries, right? Now, I said that the Roman army had withdrawn in the early 4th century. Rome remains officially a colony until, Britain remains officially a colony until 410. So I jumped the gun on that one, early 5th century. The first British Christian whose name we know is St. Alban, who was martyred in 304. Some would argue much earlier, but that's a minority opinion. Important figures we're going to encounter in Romano-British Christianity are Ninian, Patrick, and Columba. Now, this is because there's travel going on, right? Why would you travel to Britain in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries? where you get tin. In the mines in Cornwall, the stannaries in Cornwall, and you need tin to alloy copper to make bronze. Bronze is still used for many things, not for weapons. Iron is arising in weapons. But you still need tin for a lot of things. So there's a trade going forth. And there are still some Romano-Britons running around. The one who nobody's ever able to really identify, but who's referred to in the original annals as the Dux Britannorum, or the war leader of the Britons, is who?
Arthur.
King Arthur. This is where the legend of King Arthur comes up, that there's a remaining sort of Romano-British war leader who's trying to keep, things together. Nobody's come up with real good evidence of him, but it's a nice story. You'll note, though, that where is Arthur's power originally consolidated in the Arthurian legend? In Cornwall. The Duke of Cornwall is where Uther Pendragon first comes into the castle and Arthur is conceived. Tin is still important. This is where there's still some commerce going on. Most of this is going to pass from the scene when the Anglo-Saxons invade starting in the 5th century, or later in the 5th century. When the Germanic peoples invade, the old sort of group that is, there's still going to be some people over in Ireland that will have, because we see what? Patrick is going over there. We still have people like St. Bride. We still have monasteries in Ireland that will then send monks to northern England and to parts of Brittany and sort of reestablish some learning on the continent and in Britain. Do you all remember a book that came out about 10 years ago called How the Irish Saved Civilization? That's what that book's about, how learning was kept alive in the West in Irish monasteries. We're going to take a quick break here and reconvene in 5 minutes.
Sounds like my friend Michelle is doing dishes in there.
There'll be a test when he gets back.
Will there really?
No.
No, I didn't think so.
Teasing.
That's
We
good.
would all fail.
Well, there's a lot to absorb.
Yeah. It's not particularly easy.
But it certainly is interesting.
Yeah, well, it's a good skeleton on which you can hang on stuff onto that gives you a good basic history.
I think he's a very good teacher, too.
Pardon me?
I think he's a very good teacher.
Oh,
or a
yeah.
very good lecturer.
If you're like me and I prefer lectures to interactive learning. So I love it.
Well, I like both, but I certainly do like the lectures.
He has some degree of bona fides, they would say in Latin.
Are there 2 more sessions this year, this spring? Or does this?
Yes.
I think there are, through May, I think, April and May.
Yeah, there are 2 more. One in April 14th and May 12th.
My son will be here. I should have him come.
Well, you can get these even if you don't make it.
Oh,
To
okay.
a class. You can get the handouts. Now, in the Old Testament ones, there's not really any handouts. But in this one, I could.
Yeah, he brings one to school.
Well, because it's just too much. So much history. know something about, unlike some of the stuff in the Old Testament where most of it's like mythic. Whereas this, you can kind of hang your hat on some of it. You know,
Yes, there are enough names and situations that we in this that keeps us or gives us a basis for learning the rest.
Galatians, did he invent gelato?
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 I don't think so, but let's see if there's a common root there.
Yeah?
Where do you see gelato?
It's a Italian.
Like ice cream.
Right, but did you say you saw it in here?
No, there was a person.
Of course, you can find it right here in Sheboygan too now.
Yeah.
Who sells gelato here? Well, other than Il Ritrovo.
Walmart.
You can get, well, I don't know.
Well,
I can say we have a decent gelato even there.
Baron Gutsucker is in the business of making it, and his goes to Kohler, is sold in Kohler, and he's won prizes around the world for his gelato.
While we're waiting on one or two others, questions or comments so far?
How smooth. Okay, so during this early fathers section from 1896 to mid-3rd century, you know, when they're consolidating like the Petrine supremacy, it seems like it went smooth. Like, oh, first was Clement the first, then it was Ignatius. Did people really? Do you know if people accepted it easily? Like, was it just a given that everyone went along with, or were there any skirmishes because they said, oh, you know, who are you to tell me that I'm your son instead of your brother?
I'm sure there was pushback, but do we have good records of that? No.
Because the winner gets to write the history.
Kind of, yeah. You know, I mean, if we go back and look at the records in the Vatican, the earliest records that you would find there now, other than some biblical manuscripts, would be what's called the Muratorian fragment, which is where we get the development of what books are in and what books are out in the Bible. That's from about the year 220. And so this is about the same time that there's, development in Petrine supremacy. Are there other documents from that time period that might be, imperial rescripts directed to the Bishop of Rome questioning anything? I don't know. If they exist, have they been published? I don't know. They're probably cataloged. I mean, contrary to what Dan Brown would have us believe, Rome hasn't actually tried to hide anything. But, when you're talking with archives that go back close to 2 millennia, as well archived as they may be, there's still things that people have to go look for. And I had a friend who was doing research in the musical archives in Vienna on the composer Johann Nepomuk Hummel for her doctorate, and you'd find in, old musical libraries in Vienna, musical manuscripts that have just never been cataloged. They've been sitting around for a couple hundred years, and that's pretty common in a lot of institutions. Certainly if we go and try to reconstruct what happened at Grace Episcopal Church in 1975, other than certain official records, it's going to be kind of difficult, right? Let's take a look at, what slide are we on here? We're going to slide number 6. And that takes us to just a quick map here to show you Britain. And you see on the left-hand side, on the eve of the German invasions in the 6th century, who is who? Well, notice on the Kentish coast there, you see the East Angles. This is where England is going to get the name England. It's from the Angles, the Anglia. you see there are various other groups running around. The Welsh, for example, are still speaking, well, Welsh, the language, is a variation on what is called Old Brittonic. And so it is a very old Celtic language that is not really related to Gaelic, but is certainly not English. The Welsh are going to retreat into the west and fight the English for a very long time. I once drove down the road into Aberystwyth, Wales. And as you come down the hill, because it's a real interesting little stone road coming in, you have to make what is a blind curve. And right when you come around the curve, there is a stone wall facing you, where you can see before you come around the curve, painted across the road, it says Araf, which means stop. Once you come around the curve, it says stop. This is probably a lingering effort to kill Englishmen. But you see that you've got different peoples here. Northern Scotland is the Picts. We've got Celtic kingdoms. We've got Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And we've got Mercia and her dependencies. Now, that's by the 8th century. But I'm just giving you a little background on some of the what's happening in parallel at a geopolitical level. And that takes us to what's happening in mission with the Celts. As I said before, Christian houses remain in Ireland. Ireland is not really well connected with the continent, but does send missionaries. And so, for example, the mission in St. Gallen, which means St. Gallen, in Switzerland is founded by the Irish. The church in Ireland is Episcopal in structure, Roman in character and practice, with close ties to Gaul, to Western France. Ninian is instructed in Rome, maybe Gaul. Patrick is a Romano-British aristocrat. His father's a deacon, his grandfather's a priest. What does that tell you right away? Well, it also tells you that clerical celibacy is not common yet. Clerical celibacy does not get enforced till about the 9th century. Patrick, and it wasn't well practiced in many circles, right? Patrick is kidnapped by slavers. He's sold into slavery in Ireland, and he eventually escapes, and then he decides that God is sending him back to Ireland, and he ends up evangelizing Ireland. Now, he's not the first one to try to evangelize Ireland. About 20 years before him, there is St. Palladius, who is specifically sent there by the Pope. But Palladius basically fails in mission, and so it's Patrick who's going to come back and really establish something. Palladius is sent there to intervene in a problem. What is the problem? Pelagianism. Pelagius is a British monk, and he basically argues that we can cooperate with the grace of God to save ourselves. Pelagianism is the idea, when you hear people talk about Pelagianism in the modern church, they're basically talking about works righteousness. That by doing a bunch of good works, I can say, be a better person and save myself. I don't think anybody in the modern church would argue that you could save yourself through good works, but we tend to focus on being a better person rather than salvation. Pelagius basically argues, though, that you can earn salvation points by cooperating with the grace of the Holy Spirit. This is rejected as a heresy. Pelagius dies at a ripe old age, and he's fine. So if you've ever seen the movie Robin and Marian, where the Pope strangles him, that's another Hollywood fiction, okay? Pelagius has never been considered to be a deadly threat to the church, but he's kind of getting hold in Ireland, or there are reports of that, so the Pope sends Palladius to Ireland, and he probably remains there about a year. Then we get St. Bridget of Kildare, known to people of my generation and earlier as St. Bride. linked in name and feast with a pagan goddess. She led a double house. Kildare means the place of the oak, and a double house means that you've got men and women in the same monastery. When you refer to St. Brigid, if you're going to use that name, you really have to say Bridget of Kildare, because there's also St. Bridget of Sweden, who's a fairly prominent saint. So the church in Ireland becomes monastic in character, organized around tribes, because there is no kingdom in Ireland yet, with the abbot as the primary authority. The bishop has sacramental authority, but the abbot has real authority because he's the head, or she is the head of the monastery. We get the monastery at Iona in the Inner Hebrides. If we go back up on the map, the Inner Hebrides are where? In here, off the west coast of Scotland. And we have the monastery at Iona established by St. Columba, and this is going to become the center for Celtic Christianity. Now, St. Columba is going to end up in Switzerland, where he's referred to as Gallen, and this is where we get the monastery of St. Gallen. And what's going on in the meantime? A bunch of German tribes are invading. Beginning in the 5th century, the Celts are pushed west and north. By about the year 600, the Anglo-Saxons possess virtually all of what is now England. In 597, Augustine is sent from Rome by Gregory the Great. He is greeted in Kent by Ethelred, who accepts the faith and converts the kingdom of Essex. Now, later on, when we get to the Protestant Reformation, we're going to come across a phrase in Latin, cuius regio eius religio, his realm, their faith. Because the principle that's adopted as sort of a peace treaty in a lot of the wars of religion is, if your prince converts, so does everybody in the land. And so to this day, you see the River Mainz in Germany is kind of the Mason-Dixon line of Germany. North of there, you're Protestant. South of there, you're Catholic, nominally. What's happening is that once Ethelred converts to Christianity, word's going to get back to the continent. And so the Pope sends St. Augustine to England to sort of reestablish the church in England.
You keep saying Ethelred, and you mean Ethelbert?
Yes. Ethelred the unready Ethelbert here. Yes. Okay, sorry,
That's
Ethelbert.
I was asking.
All right. Here's the problem Augustine runs into. He shows up and he's there to sort of like establish the church in England. What does he find? There's a church already there. And it is a Celtic church that is based more in the north. This is going to become an important point in arguments between the Anglican Communion and the Roman Catholic Church. What is referred to as the Ecclesia Anglicanorum, the early English church, is there before the Roman missions to England. And so you get sort of a parallel development for a while between the South and the North, with the South doing things the Roman way, and the North doing, and the West doing things the Celtic way. In 1664, a synod is called in Whitby, which is in Northumbria, because of disputes in Northumbria. So we're pretty far north. And St. Hilda, who is one of the saints on our reredos in this parish, she presides. And union is achieved. Now, Hilda does this in part by saying that unity is more important than particularity. And so she is willing to agree to the Roman way of calculating the date of Easter. To this day, There is a different calculation in the Eastern Church and the Western Church over the date of Easter. It's fairly rare that we get Easter on the same day, in the same week. Well, there's the same problem with the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. Hilda is willing to do that and willing to accept most of the liturgical changes that have arisen in Rome. What is known as the Leonine Mass. We tend to think of one way of doing Holy Eucharist, right? But actually, early on in the church, there's more than one way. And so these are called uses. So you get the Leonine use comes out of Rome under Pope Leo the Great we talked about. You have, however, other forms of the Mass. You've got the Ambrosian Rite, which is out of Milan. You've got the Mozarabic Rite, which is out of Spain. And you have the Sarum Rite, which is Salisbury. So the Book of Common Prayer is going to arise out of the Sarum Rite. Then you get what are called Gallican innovations, because the French are going to do things their own way. And then you get various innovations east of there, what's called the Glagolitic Mass, which isn't in Latin. But that's actually later. When Hilda is present, things are just different in terms of how you do the Mass and how you calculate Easter. And basically the Celtic missions, monasteries in the north say, it's more important for there to be one church, so we're going to do it the way it comes out of Rome because the rest of Europe is doing it that way. As a result, England is brought into the mainstream. If you want to argue a counterfactual history and have fun, just start saying what happens if they don't agree. And England remains more isolated as a Celtic presence. You can have some fun with that one. The independence of the English Church is respected, but governance is centralized now in Canterbury. And Theodore of Tarsus becomes the first Archbishop of Canterbury to be recognized in all of Britain. Now, what's the little clue to his name there? Tarsus, right? Who else was born in Tarsus? Paul. Where is Tarsus? Yeah, it's in the Mideast. Theodore of Tarsus is the last Archbishop of Canterbury to come from the Eastern Church. He's a Syrian. And so the first unified Church of England, not that it's called that yet, the Church in England, is under a Syrian Archbishop. But remember, there's basically, between the Empire and the papacy, it's still like one world, kind of like the Roman Empire. So the fact that you got a Syrian serving in England is no big deal. There are plenty of English people, in the East. If you go to Turkey today or to Syria, you see this all the time on, the news with Syria. You get sort of fair-haired, blue-eyed people that are usually referred to as Anatolian Turks. What are they? They're Celts. The Celtae have come to the Mideast, and they are referred to as what? The Galatians. Celtae becomes Galatean in the Eastern languages. So when Paul is writing his letter to the Galatians, there is no place that's Galatia. He's writing to a people, to an area. And these are Celts who have settled and become Easterners. Yes?
So Hilda was a bishop?
Hilda was an abbess, and so an abbot or an abbess has the same authority as a bishop. This is what's known in canon law as an ordinary. And so if you wanted to be really canonical about it, you'd say that Bishop Matthew is our ordinary. Now, that's not a term used too much in Anglican canon law in this province at any rate. It is in the Church of England. But that would be, what you'd find in the Roman Catholic Code of Canon Law. So yes, an ordinary, an abbot or an abbess has sometimes called a prior. They have the authority of an ordinary within their jurisdiction. Jurisdiction.
So how did that was that?
There's not a distinction being made at that point because of the formation of religious orders. She doesn't have authority outside of the monastery, but she has authority inside of the monastery over men. Remember, the church is the counterculture. In Roman law, what is a personal jurisdiction is known as a mund, M-U-N-D. And a Roman mund becomes, under canon law, the personal jurisdiction of the ordinary. Later on, when we see the developments in law that give rise to things like corporations and insurance syndicates and everything, in common law, which is English law, a bishop is going to be known as a corporation sole, corporation of one person. This became an issue in canon law in the Episcopal Church in the last 6 months because the Bishop of Los Angeles declared himself a corporation sole for purposes of alienating property that had been ordered by the presiding bishop not to sell. And you can find all these reports about what's been going on in the Diocese of L.A., but it's not been pretty.
How was it resolved?
He has been inhibited and prohibited from functioning as a bishop or priest. And there are other disciplinary proceedings going on because the trial tribunal concluded that he perpetrated a fraud upon the court, which is never a good idea. Then we get the Anglo-Saxon thing going on, right? Now, these are German invasions. Pushed west, we talked about Whitley. We've already gone there. And that takes us to slide number 8, what we call Carolingian Christianity. Who are we talking about when we say something is Carolingian? Charlemagne. It means great Carl, great Charles, Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus in Latin. At this point, feudalism is kind of gotten going, right? And so the church owns about 25% of all land. Incidentally, if you go to England today, or Great Britain, I should say, if you look at the largest landowners in Great Britain, the first is the Crown. The second is the Ministry of Defense. The third is Trinity College of Cambridge University. And the fourth is the Church of England.
The church.
Church of England. Trinity College owns vast tracts of Scotland and a lot of the land between Cambridge and London. All grants from Henry VII. This is how you finance things. You give people land. Great big tracts of land, as Monty Python would say, right? So the church is part of the feudal system and claims leadership not on the basis of goodness, not because we're the church and we're nice people, but due to the exclusive prerogative of clergy to celebrate the sacraments. See how institutional churches assert control, right? If the sacraments are necessary for your eternal soul, and you're worried about being damned to hell, if I withhold the sacraments from you, I'm exercising real power over you. And so being an excommunicate, or if, you really get, the king really gets in trouble, the Pope might interdict the country. What does interdict mean? It means that no sacraments can be celebrated in your country. What's the general reaction of the nobles and people if the king has caused interdict to arise? Get a different king, right? So there's a lot of power being exercised here. And as good Romans, as inheritors of the Roman Empire and Roman law, there is a passion for order. Things are organized now. painting with an extremely broad brush here. We're seeing three overlapping periods. 5th to the 11th centuries, Catholic faith spreads among the Aryan and pagan barbarians of Europe. Who are the Aryans?
They came from the west. They were barbarians from the west.
Well, they're mainly Western peoples, although there are a lot in the East. Arius is the priest in Egypt who says that Jesus is a created being. This is why we get the Nicene Creed, and we talked about the Christological controversies in the last class. There's a point in time where at least half of all Christians in the world are Arian Christians. And there's a point in time when most of the army and most of the imperial court are Arians. What we consider to be the Orthodox Christian faith does not gain ascendancy right up front. So we start seeing the Catholic faith, Orthodox Christianity, spreading now where Arians are converted to the Catholic faith and where pagan barbarians who have come in from the East are being converted to the Catholic faith. Even some, move into places like Scotland with the Picts and into Russia and what is now Kiev with the Varangians and the Slavs. So we're seeing Christianity really spread. Then we get a period of domination in the 12th and 13th centuries. The church becomes a theocracy under a monarchic pope. The church seeks to assert freedom from lay control. What happens once King John accedes to the barons and signs Magna Carta in 1215?
It's to share his power with the nobility.
Right, and what happens is that the Pope nullifies it and declares Magna Carta invalid. Now, it ends up being readopted in 1220, but the Pope has supreme appellate authority in these issues. And exercises real power. We get the Gregorian reforms under Gregory the Great, claims of the papacy, church authority over the sacraments is advanced. This is a consolidation of power. And then we get a disintegration. 14th and 15th centuries, religious, political, social system begins to pull apart. We get some conflicting forces. What's the background noise here, though, first, if we go back to the 13th century? What's the background noise that really unsettles things in the feudal system? The Black Death. Black Death really hits a couple times, but principally in 1346. In the 14th century, things start falling apart because of the Black Death. What also arises in the same very broad era? Gunpowder. And so where you have been able to rule because you have a castle, now you can't. So things are getting really stirred up. In the course of things getting really stirred up at an economic level, at a level of human life, of people dying of plague, and at a level of geopolitical systems and trade, things are topsy-turvy. And so this is when, quite naturally, there are changes in how authority works. But at the same time, you see developments in thought. And so we start seeing the idea that science and revelation might be something that we look at slightly differently. If we go back to Francis Bacon, a good monk, doing scientific experiments, if we go back to Occam, doing good scientific experiments, you get these good Dominican ways of thinking at things in religious orders, and you start sitting there and saying, well, wait a minute. Now, we're not yet to the point where powers of observation are going to be improved enough that we can see their moons on a different planet or that we can sit there and see bacteria. But we are getting to the point where there is a very early form of scientific method arising. Scientific method, let's just do real quick and dirty on that. scientific method, I would have to posit a thesis. And the thesis would be that too much sodium in my diet is going to, over the years, on a population basis, not necessarily on an individual basis, give rise to an increase in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. That hypertension is related to sodium intake in some populations. That's the thesis. Now I have to test the thesis with an experiment. The experiment is designed to see whether the thesis is correct or not. So I have to have a measurable result, and the result has to be reproducible. So it's not just some random thing. If you ever want to have fun, go find a journal you can find in a lot of libraries called the Journal of Irreproducible Results. It's hilarious. It's a scientific spoof that comes out once a quarter. You start seeing experimentation. This costs Francis Bacon his life because he's trying to preserve some kind of fowl, a goose, I think, with snow, and gets sick and dies. And, so, you know, there's always been a price to be paid for the advancement in science, right? We talk in our Greek class about the difference between deductive learning and inductive learning. In inductive learning, we're sitting sort of like making observations and drawing conclusions from them. Deductive learning, we're actually saying, well, here are the rules and here's how it works. The difference between the scientific method and revelation is also reflected as a difference basically in Aristotelian reasoning on inductive reasoning. And so you sit there and you explain something on the basis of how you observe it in nature. And you come up with an explanation that is consonant with how the overall system works. And so you say it is in the nature of this animal to do this because of how this animal fits within the overall hierarchy of the celestial spheres. If you ever want to read a book about this, brilliant book that people have completely forgotten that C.S. Lewis wrote, it's called The Shattered Image. And it basically says, if you go back and look at how Aristotelian and medieval science works, this is how the world works. This is how you view reality. And it's all revealed to you. This is why Scripture is so important, God revealing how the world works. Once you start making observations and drawing conclusions and doing scientific experiments, you get a different worldview. Now, let's be careful. We live in an era where we think in the general population, there's some idea that there's a fundamental conflict between faith and reason. There isn't. These are two different ways of experiencing reality, and they're not in conflict with each other. But when this arises first, people are sitting there going like, well, wait a minute. I'm going to try this. You know, I mean, there's some experiments that are better than others. Like if you want to sit there and like burn your hand with a candle, it's not a good idea, right? But this is why you sit there, and if you look at medieval trials, if you go back and look at a movie, how do you try somebody? It's trial by ordeal, right? You know, remember Monty Python? She turned me into a newt. You know, I got better. You know, is she going to float or is she going to rise? Do you burn the person's hand and then bind it? And is the wound clean in 3 days? We're seeing in England the rise of common law at the same time. We move from trial by ordeal or trial by combat to trial by compurgation. If I'm in a lawsuit and Lisa's on the other side, well, in this day and age, she'd have to have a man come into court, you know. But that's in that day and age. But if Dale's on the other side, we both come in and we make an oath about what happened, who owns the property, right? We've both made an oath on pain of our eternal souls, right? And what we have to do is produce compurgators. These are 12 people in where we live, our 100. This is how we get 12 people on a jury. And
That's why it doesn't work anymore.
yeah, and they are supposed to come in and say, having heard Dale's oath, that his oath is clean. They vouch for him telling the truth. The last time we saw compurgation at law, and it really didn't work very well, was when? The confirmation hearings for Clarence Thomas. He had Anita Hill come in, and people came in and said she was telling the truth. And then you had Clarence Thomas come in, and people said he was telling the truth, and the senators ruled. The reason we developed cross-examination of witness and rules of evidence is computation doesn't work real well, right? But this is what's going on. There are all kinds of rules changing here, because how much of this is revelation and how much of this is going to be stuff that we can classify. So we've got science and revelation, individual religious experience versus sacerdotal authority, priestly authority. We're going to see a couple religious movements that we'll detail in later classes where lay people get more involved in things that look a little bit like living like a monk, but you're still living in community in town. We get the Beguines, are women who do this. We get Begards, are men who do this. And yes, it is the same spelling as the old Cole Porter song, Begin the Beguine. I don't know what the connection is there. But apparently a beguine becomes a type of music as well. We get the nation-state's sovereignty versus papal authority. And we're going to see throughout medieval and early Renaissance times struggles over who gets to appoint a bishop. Is it the king or is it the pope? Who gets to do this? Who gets to do that? So there are all these power struggles going on. Now, if we go back to the late 5th, early 6th centuries, we get the conversion of Clovis, who becomes the king of the Franks. These are a Germanic people in what is now France. It's not real popular to point out that the French's first king is a German, but, you know. He converts. Yeah. He converts. St. Remigius converts him. St. Remigius is out of Heidelberg in Germany. And he is the first non-Arian Germanic leader. Now you can go find Clovis's grave. It's still around. He's in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis in Paris, which is the original Gothic architecture, the model for Chartres. That's a fascinating place, and you find all these early French kings in there. But you also find Marie Antoinette's grave there. And there are some die-hard monarchists who always come out and put ribbons and flowers around her grave to try to bring back the true monarchy. And you can get in long arguments as to whether the legitimate claimant to the French throne is the current Duc d'Orléans or the, I forget the other claimant right now, but the Valois. But the, that's a tangent. Here's where Dan Brown's going to have fun again with the Merovingians, right? In the Da Vinci Code. And so you get 2 centuries of despotism tempered by assassination. These are fun people. Political power is personal and local. These are basically warlords. Public authority is in private hands. You can buy a franchise for the, you know, the territory, and if you produce enough tribute, you're good. The Carolingians rise as mayor of the palace, the Merovingian palace. Pepin is educated by monks at Saint-Denis outside of Paris. He is favorably disposed to the papacy. He is anointed by St. Boniface with oil blessed by the Pope, and therefore becomes king by divine sanction. There's another statue on our Reredos, Boniface, who is an Englishman who becomes the apostle to the Germans. Why is he killed with axes? He's killed with axes because he takes an axe and cuts down a tree sacred to the god Odin, where people gather in Fulda, and some people react to that. I've given you a picture on the next page of Charles Martel, which literally means Charles the Hammer, defeating the Muslim invasion of France. Now remember, the Muslims rule Spain at this point, and will so for a couple more centuries. They invade northern Europe, and Charles Martel, who has originally arisen from the Carolingian dynasty, defeats them at the Battle of Tours. What is the principal reason for his victory here? And then we also see the Battle of Poitiers. You can't see it in this photo. Well, you could say it's the cross in Hoc-Signon. What the painting does show is he's fighting how? From a horse with an axe. The stirrup has come to France. The Muslims don't have the stirrup. And so armored warfare versus infantry, who's usually going to win? Right? Unless you're in an urban setting, right, Dale? In which case you better send in infantry with the tanks, right? You saw that in Grozny around the turn of the century, right? Carolingian Christianity. We got a, sort of a new empire going here. The central feature of European history between the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West and the emergence of the feudal monarchies in the 13th century is going to be the Carolingians. Where are they based? It's now called the city of Aachen in Germany. It's also known as Aix-la-Chapelle in French. What's happening here is power is shifting northward because the Mediterranean world is collapsing. Why? Because the Muslims are winning. They've taken over all of North Africa. They've taken most of the Middle East. There is an Eastern Empire holed up in Constantinople, but there's ongoing warfare. And so any of the old Mediterranean powers cannot exercise power north of the Alps because they're fighting the Muslims. So we see a new power center arising in Europe north of the Alps. And the Franks emerge as the first world power here with the European center of gravity. The recognition of Pepin leads to emancipation of the papacy from the constitutional framework of the Eastern Empire. See how it's in the papacy's interest, they're in the Mediterranean, south of the Alps, to recognize the Frankish king as emperor, because the Eastern emperor, who is a Greek, is not really able to do much in Italy at this point. And the papacy is in effect saying we need more power at a military level here. So we get Charlemagne being crowned in 800 by the Pope. How's that for a politic move, right? But this leads to, with the consolidation of power, a certain renaissance. We've got learning being revived under Alcuin of York, a British monk who acts as advisor to Charlemagne and establishes schools. And this is when we start getting good illuminated manuscripts and things of that sort. The education of clergy is improved. It's improved in the sense that it's regularized. There are now standards for how clergy get educated. There are canons for clergy, for monasteries, for parishes, and for cathedral chapters, but now they're enforced. There's never been any way to hold people accountable before. It's kind of like Anglicanism. Organization of parishes becomes a priority. Before this, if you were going to have a priest around, he's at the castle. He's there to service the Lord, right? He's not caring about what's happening in the town. How's he getting his food? From the castle. Bishops are charged to supervise rural clergy through rural deans and archdeacons. So if we just take the Diocese of Fond du Lac as an example, we have an archdeacon and a rural dean in this parish. Does this mean we are a seat of power in the diocese? No. We get an emphasis on education, fostering a climate of respect for book learning and for the patronage of schools. Now, this is where we start seeing more books than scrolls. A book is a codex, and this is where you start seeing codices arise. Well, they're actually earlier than that, but this is where they become the dominant form. The Carolingian Empire is destroyed by dynastic civil wars, pretty typical, right? And by the Vikings. The Norsemen show up. What's the legacy? Western Europe is defined as within the sphere of Latin Christianity. And we get a preservation and diffusion of Latin culture. Remember back when Pope Damasus commissioned the translation of the Bible into Latin. That's what's been used. The Bible in the East is still in Greek. So the power centers are going to continue to evolve on this basis. The real legacy other than Latin culture is theocratic kingship and feudal structure. This is the divine right of kings' heyday. There have been many claims for it made since, but this is where it really gets going. Again, to quote Monty Python, didn't know we had a king. He's the one who doesn't have blank all over him like the rest of us. Questions so far? We're really breezing through a lot of stuff here, but we want to leave time at the end for questions and discussion of some of the things that our two official students have written in their papers. So
if is the divine right of kingship?
not necessarily. A theocracy says that the religious power structure or figure is in charge. That could be that the archbishop is claiming certain or the pope is claiming authority over the king. There have been examples where you get theocratic kingship in the sense of the king is claiming direct religious authority. Between the years 1603 and 1917, that would have been true in Russia because there was no patriarch. The Holy Synod basically became a department of the Tsar's government and household. So when you talk about Caesaropapism, which would be where you were combining religious and political authority, we tend to think of that as an Eastern sort of Greek thing. Caesaropapism never really developed fully in the Eastern Empire, but it did in Russia. Under the Tsars, you did have actual Caesaropapism. Now we're going to go back. You see how we keep going back and forward because there's so many things going on here. So we're going to go back here to Gregory the Great. You see the dates for his reign as Pope. The Council of God. It's like God's going to call Gregory up and say, what do you think? Papal influence and prestige extend north of the Alps. This is when the pallium is bestowed by the Pope as a symbol of metropolitan authority. What's a pallium? Yeah, if you look at a chasuble, thank you. On a chasuble, you see these three things like this. A pallium is independent of a chasuble, and it is a white stole that is given to one with metropolitan authority. What does it mean, metropolitan authority? It means that he has authority over ordinaries. Ordinaries are bishops. Metropolitans are archbishops. The pallium is still bestowed by the Pope upon anybody appointed an archbishop. And they're all made by the same nuns, with the same wool from the same flock of sheep, maintained by the order of St. Agnes. And Agnes is probably a play on words on Agnus, Lamb of God. So, but yes, the pallium is, in Anglicanism you wouldn't notice it other than a shape on a chasuble. But in Rome it is restricted to an archbishop.
Can I ask you, do you have any idea why it was kept in Anglicanism if it's a Catholic symbol?
Well, let's be careful. Anglicanism would view it as a Catholic symbol, small c, and say it's just a symbol of authority. And since then, people have made other arguments about Trinitarian symbolism. They're pretty weak. it's basically like, well, if the Romans are going to do it, we're going to have it too, sort of thing, But, this is when we start seeing the formation of an actual political entity, the papal state. We then get Nicholas I in the 9th century. His is the most significant papacy following Gregory's. He establishes a single coherent theory of papal supremacy. Now, he makes use of the false decretals, otherwise known as the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals. This is a series of documents which includes the so-called Donation of Constantine. Documents, canonical materials, many are authentic, some are apocryphal. The Donation of Constantine is proven subsequently to be a forgery. But basically it is a collection intended to defend the rights of bishops against metropolitans and to assert papal supremacy and jurisdiction. The Donation of Constantine is supposedly a letter written by the Emperor Constantine to the Bishop of Rome saying, here's all the land I'm giving you in the Italian peninsula. We then get Gregory VII. This is where we get the Cluniac reforms, the Abbey of Cluny in Paris, France. Temporal as well as spiritual papal supremacy are asserted. The Pope is acting like a king now within his territories, right? Gregory asserts that the Pope can depose the Emperor. This is what gets the last patriarch of Russia before the Bolsheviks in trouble. Patriarch Nikon I assumes the title of Veliki Gosudar, which we would roughly translate as Great or Dread Overlord, which is a title reserved to the Tsar. Tsar Peter I does not take kindly to this. When the patriarch seeks to say, you are my pupil and I will teach you. But Gregory VII basically asserts this in an 11th century bull Dictatus Papae. Papal prestige is basically being reasserted because post-Nicholas I, things have gone down. There haven't been as able leaders and other stuff's going on. The papacy had to become a pawn of rival Italian political families and will remain so for some time, right? Leo IX continues the reforms after his installation by the German Emperor Henry III. Leo engages in clerical reforms. Now, first he's dealing with simony. What's simony? The selling of sacraments for money. The selling of religious grace for money. A serious sin that you can find in the Acts of the Apostles, right? That Simon Magus tries to buy the Holy Spirit from Peter, right? Incidentally, Simon Magus, most church historians would say, is probably the principal author of Gnosticism. Then we get pluralism. What's pluralism? This is holding more than one see. So suppose the Bishop of Fond du Lac is reigning from Appleton. But he also happens to be, I don't know, the Bishop of Quincy, Illinois. But he's never there, except once a year to show up and kind of like sprinkle people with water or something like that. But he gets tribute out of Quincy, and this is pluralism. And it eventually comes to be condemned that you have to, have your authority in one jurisdiction. Because remember, this is a way to make money. If you're a feudal lord, where's your wealth? Land. And so if you've got Quincy down here producing agricultural products and income, it's to your interest to have more than one see. Pope starts regularizing that. Lay investiture, what's that? This is where the king says, I'm installing a bishop. And so if the King of England were to sit there and say that this person's going to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, that would be lay investiture. Now, this is going to become a really big battle between various kings and emperors and the papacy. The German emperors who become the Holy Roman Empire, which is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but that's an old trope. The German empires are really going to fight over this, because is there a country called Germany? No, it's a series of little principalities, and half of them are ruled by archbishops. And so that's where the money's coming from. When the emperor has to go, the Pope excommunicates the emperor, who travels across the Alps and finds the Pope at the castle of Canossa. And the emperor is dressed in sackcloth and is barefoot in the snow. And the Pope makes him wait at the gates for 3 days. Because the emperor is convinced of what? He's been excommunicated, so what's going to happen to him? Going to hell. This is important to him. He also recognizes that if the papacy really turns on the German Empire at this point, he's got a political problem with his own princes. So it's not only a spiritual petition. And that's a safe rule throughout all of the disputes we're going to see throughout church history. There's never purity of motive. There's always a spiritual motive and a political and economic motive. So, it's called follow the money. And then we see clerical incontinence. What does that mean? Let's just say clergy are not leading very pure lives. If you are a fan of some interesting 20th century music, Carmina Burana by Karl Orff, the German composer, you hear it now at football games, where they do that spooky music from the beginning, Carmina Burana. How does that start out? O fortuna velut luna statu variabilis. What happens, Carmina Burana in Latin means little songs of Boiron, the Benedictine Abbey in Boiron. And these were manuscripts found in a trunk in the Abbey. They're from this time period. Orff sets them to music. But they're being sung, and so you have a song like Ego sum abbas Cucaniensis. I am the abbot of Cucani, and my deliberation is amongst drinkers. And then he goes on and sings a drunken song. Or you get Juvene juvencule conjunguntur merito, young man and young woman happily coupling. It's about sex and drinking. This is what's happening in some of the monasteries, right? And so the Pope's saying, wait a minute, time out. We've got to regulate things again and assert some authority. This is when clerical celibacy gets enforced. It has become the norm for at least a century and a half before Leo IX, but now it becomes the rule. Now, we talked, I think in the first class, maybe the second one where we talked about the creeds, about the difference between dogma, doctrine, and discipline, right? Clerical celibacy arises as a matter of discipline. It does not get classified as dogma until, not dogma, doctrine in the church in Rome until when? 1996.
What?
Yes. There's always an open question as to whether it's a matter of discipline, and you can change it. John Paul II says it's a matter of doctrine, and I am defining doctrine. And you can still find arguments in the Catholic Church today as to whether that is an infallible statement. Actually, 1980. Is that an infallible statement of the Pope or not? You get partisans on both sides of that in the Roman Catholic Church. So there are those who argue you could make somebody a priest who, a person who is married can become a priest. Right now in the Catholic Church, you can be married and be a priest. If you are incardinated as a married person who is already in holy orders. And so if you go under the pastoral provision of John Paul II, or under Anglicanorum Setibus of Benedict XVI, you can become a Catholic priest if you were an Anglican priest or a Lutheran pastor, and there are a couple others. It's not common, happens. I have 4 classmates from my graduating class in seminary who are Catholic priests with their wife and child in tow. They tend not to assign you to a parish because it raises awkward questions, usually working in a diocesan office. Within the last month, there has been a proposal in Brazil that the way to get priests into some of the more remote areas, and this is a church proposal, not a government proposal, is to allow married men to be ordained as priests. So if you're a married priest in the Episcopal Church and you become incarnated in the Catholic Church and your wife dies, you can never remarry. But this would be, if you were married, you could be ordained. And so that's re-raised the issue, is this a matter of discipline or doctrine? And if a matter of doctrine, was that an infallible pronouncement by the Pope or not? There are pretty strong arguments on that. I was recruited into Anglicanorum Setibus. I'll give you my reasons sometime why I said no. Then we get Nicholas II. Now we're in the 11th century. And this is where we see the election of a pope being placed in the College of Cardinals. Now, if we look at current practice and practice for centuries now in the Church of Rome, how is a pope selected, right? He's elected by the College of Cardinals. Not all cardinals get to vote, right? Because if you reach the mandatory retirement age, you can gather with your fellow cardinals, but you can't vote. And so there's always a calculation every time there's a papal election. How many cardinals are there? How many are eligible to vote? What are the voting blocks? Things of that sort. We see in the early 12th century the Concordat of Worms, double investiture. This is how we cut a deal. Papal investiture and consecration, coupled with oath of fealty to the emperor for temporalities. So, say you're going to be consecrated as the Prince Archbishop of Mainz in Germany. This is where it's really going to hit the lick log, so to speak. The German emperor is really going to worry about this. And so the deal that is cut is the Pope invests the Archbishop and consecrates him. And the Archbishop makes an oath to the Emperor to obey the civil law on issues of property and, economics, basically. So temporalities are those things that are not spiritual. So the Emperor has no say in how the Archbishop's going to appoint a priest to a parish, although the Archbishop is probably going to consult the imperial court at that time. But the Archbishop is certainly not going to alienate great big tracts of land and say that he just has the authority to do that without consulting the emperor. So what the church and the feudal powers start doing is saying, we've got to do this together. This is a change in how papal authority is viewed, and it's going to give rise, when we hit the Protestant Reformation, to the fact that princes become very much involved in the warfare over authority, because their authority is at stake in this.
Can you explain the second last bit? So what would be in for the emperor for the double investor?
The church owns 25% of the land.
And what does the emperor get?
Money, tax, tribute. Next slide. Which takes us to England. Ta-da! And we get this quotation from St. Thomas à Becket. It is certain that kings receive their power from the church, and the church hers from Christ alone. You can see the conflict just getting ready to go here, right? Now, England has been invaded and conquered by the Normans. The Duke of Normandy has become the King of England while remaining the Duke of Normandy, and lots of things are changing, right? The court is now, the power structure is being consolidated in French nobility. Things are done in French. To this day, if you are a crown colony of Great Britain, your ultimate court of appeal is the Privy Council in London. It used to be common. It's very rare to have a Privy Council appeal anymore. All proceedings in the Privy Council in the legal case are in Norman French. There aren't too many barristers who can plead your case before the Privy Council. I happen to know one, but until Canada became a republic in 1960, well, it's not really a republic, but became an independent dominion in 1967, there would be an appeal line to the Privy Council, right? Direction and control of the church is transferred from Englishmen to Normans. And the fabric of the entire church is reorganized under King William I and Archbishop Lanfranc, who had been the abbot of the abbey in Bec in Normandy. We get some new ideas. We get some new reforms. England has been kind of on the periphery, not really well integrated into European culture. Norman policy, however, is to keep the church under crown authority. And this is because of economic and legal dependence. The feudal system is really coming to England now. The conqueror has defined the sphere of papal influence in England while acknowledging spiritual primacy. But he wants to be in charge. This is William the Bastard, right? And he's not a, that's his real name originally. But he kind of lives into his name in a modern sense. And so what becomes enforced is there is no recognition of the Pope's authority in England without the king's leave. No papal communication may enter England without royal permission. No tenant-in-chief is to be excommunicated absent royal consent. What's a tenant-in-chief? These are feudal lords whose immediate overlord is the king. This would be a duke. Now, remember, royal courts are few. Courts are still primarily what are called seigneurial courts. And so you're going to be tried by your local lord, and what can go to a royal court is not entirely clear. There are two early common law writs called pone and tolt that allow you to take a case from your local manor to a royal court. It's where we get removing a case to federal court from a state court sort of thing. If you're going to excommunicate, the Duke of Kent, this is a big deal to the English crown, right? So it's not going to happen unless the king agrees to it. What else does William really enforce here? No English prelate, in other words, no archbishop, is to leave the country without royal permission. Why would this be a problem? Well, suppose the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Archbishop of York goes to Rome, cuts a deal with the Pope, and comes back, and the Pope says, we're going to enforce this. And so I might try to send a French army to enforce it or a German army. So William is really asserting control over the church. This is going to lay the groundwork for Henry VIII doing the same thing in about another, 500 some years. No church councils are to be convened or canons enacted absent royal sanction. The church is being established as a department of state here, recognizing papal authority in a more restricted area. After William and Lanfranc are dead, we get St. Anselm, who basically asserts the Gregorian reforms. He is the third pole in the investiture controversy between Gregory VII and the Emperor Henry IV. So I told you that story about the emperor outside the castle at Canossa. Anselm's the third pole in that dispute. And it's an issue that's important in England because of what William's been up to. We end up with what's called the Concordat of London. This is going to anticipate the formula that's adopted 15 years later as the Concordat of Worms, which basically says there will be an oath of fealty sworn by the Archbishop to the King for temporalities, but he's otherwise answerable to the Pope. The Church is perceived in England as a rival to the Crown, and kingship, therefore, starts being increasingly defined as secular, as sort of a counterbalancing pole. You can see all the seeds being sown for the rise of the Church of England here. Henry II is determined to restore the ancient customs. He wants to go back and be Norman, you know. What is this, all this stuff, you know? We're going to have crown authority here. And he ends up in open breach with Thomas à Becket over criminis clerks, or clerks, I should say, in English. Now, Henry II and Becket are good friends from youth. They've hunted together. They've gone drinking together. They've done all these things. Henry decides he wants his own archbishop. So he has Becket ordained, which isn't Becket's idea. And he resists it, and then he eventually is made Archbishop of Canterbury, and Henry comes to rue that decision. So he thinks he's putting his buddy on the see of the church in England, and that way he can control him. As soon as Becket's ordained, he says, he's got a different master, and starts pushing back against the king. At the end of the day, they get into a fight over priests charged with criminal offenses, criminis clerks. Because this is where you get the old tradition that you're going to plead your clergy, plead your holy orders, plead your collar. If you are a priest charged with a crime that can haul you in front of a royal court, what's your defense? I'm a priest. You have no jurisdiction over me. You have to turn me over to the church to try me. What's the big difference there? Church can't execute you. The crown can. Now, you see all these things where people are being burned at the stake by the church and all that. What happens in those cases is somebody is excommunicated and handed over to the secular arm for execution. The church is not allowed to execute people. And so if you're charged with a crime that's going to get you in a royal court, pretty much all the offenses are capital, right? So you want to get into church court. And since we're seeing that, you know, the Gregorian reforms are a work in progress in a country on the periphery more like England, there seem to be some issues with criminal conduct. Becket is insistent that these people be tried in church courts. The king is insistent that they be tried in royal courts. And we get the adoption of the Constitutions of Clarendon, which is a series of statutes that form the basis for the English Constitution, that basically resolve how people get tried. Which takes us to our next slide, which is the murder of Thomas à Becket in the Cathedral at Canterbury. At one point, Henry II is sitting there, and Becket has done something else yet again, and Henry says in the midst of a drinking bout, "Will nobody rid me of this pestilential priest?" Two of the knights who are present take the king at his word and go and kill the archbishop in the cathedral, which Henry immediately turns around and denies, and there's all kinds of a flap over that, and we get Becket being declared a saint. And we get Canterbury Tales from this, right? Because everybody makes a pilgrimage to see the saint's tomb.
Well, had Becket always been had he been a priest before?
No, he was not ordained until, I don't know, maybe 10 years before he was killed. He'd been, a courtier.
So he was just a friend of
He was a friend of the king.
So
And then the
he
king
was-
said, I'll put him in there and I'll have somebody on my side. Didn't quite work out that way for the king. And so we see Becket is killed. And following his murder, Henry now submits to the Pope, because the Pope's going to excommunicate him and declare interdict on England, which means that Henry's barons will kill him. If the Pope declares interdict on England, the barons of England will rise and kill the king, or at least get rid of him. So Henry submits and agrees what's called the settlement of Avranches. And what that says is that clerics may appeal to Rome. Papal intervention now becomes a constant factor in English church affairs. More seeds being sown. In 1205, there's a disputed election for Archbishop, and Pope Innocent III makes his own appointment, Stephen Langton. Langton is consecrated without royal assent, without that old Norman agreement as to how you could appoint a bishop or an archbishop. And the king refuses to accept this result, and interdict is declared on England. The king is excommunicated, and the Pope threatens a crusade by a French army to install a proper Christian king in England. So King John surrenders his crown to the Pope and becomes formally a vassal. What's the reaction of the barons? They've got a weak king, so they're going to push him around. This loss of power and prestige results in the barons rebelling, and we get Magna Carta, which is formally sponsored by Langton. However, Innocent III annuls Magna Carta, but it's reissued by Henry III and recognized by the papacy later. So there's some back and forth power struggle going on here. The fourth major conflict in English church-state relations is at the end of the 13th century. Robert Winchelsea, the archbishop, refuses to pay taxes to the king. And he cites Clericis Laicos, which is an encyclical of Boniface VIII. Why is this important to the king?
Because they own 25% of the land.
Yeah, they own a lot of the land. You suddenly took a 25% hit on your tax revenue. It's a big deal, right? Boniface is really the last of the great medieval pontiffs here. And the bull that he issues here forbids the payment of taxes to princes anywhere, not just in England. So obviously there is a big power shift going on now. Princes are threatened with excommunication for taxing clerics. Now you can see why in another couple centuries, when the Protestant Reformation arises, you're going to have a number of princes who have a pretty good interest in maybe saying that maybe the Pope doesn't have the authority he said he had. Church and state in England become broadly allied here, but royal claims are asserted in the Statute of Provisors and the Statute of Praemunire. These are also part of the English Constitution. Taxation authority is challenged, and by extension, so is secular jurisdiction. This is going to remain a matter in tension until Henry says, Henry VIII says, here's what we're going to do. And then we're going to still have another 100 years of war and civil war and dispute over that on that basis. Now, while all that's going on the Isle of Albion, we have other stuff going on in the Mediterranean world. We get the Great Schism. Because the emperor in the East has continued to assert authority in doctrinal matters. In the Eastern Church, his position is compromised by a split in the Eastern Church. We get Egypt becoming a monophysite Christian church. Go back to your slides from last class. What is monophysitism? This is saying Christ has one nature only, right? A divine nature. He doesn't have a human nature. That's There's still monophysite churches in the East. They're not common. The Emperor Zeno, in the Henoticon of 482, tries to conciliate the monophysites, but he omits the Chalcedonian Christological formula. Remember, we talked about the Council of Chalcedon, or Chalcedon. And so the Pope reacts by denying any doctrinal authority in the emperor. In the next century, Justinian issues the 3 chapters which questions Chalcedon. And the Pope breaks communion with the Eastern Court. Then we get the title of Ecumenical Patriarch being adopted in Constantinople. The names of elected popes are submitted to the emperor for approval. And we get 13 popes that are approved this way. 11 are Greek or Syrian. Justinian is basically making the church in the East into a department of state. Once the West triumphs, virus and threat protection. Well, I'm glad they were running a scan. Once the West triumphs in the Christological controversies at the 6th Ecumenical Council, Constantinople III, it triumphs over a divided East because there are monophysites running around for important sees in the East. One of the sees of the Eastern Church is Alexandria. So we get Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. There is no see of Moscow yet. They're split. The emperor tries to reassert Eastern primacy, and in the last pope to be received in Constantinople prior to Paul VI in the 60s is Constantine II in 710. Yes, Marianne?
What year are we talking about now, or century?
Late 7th, early 8th centuries. Long time ago.
7th and
Yeah,
8th century.
7th and 8th centuries, yes. We get further problems in the East, the iconoclastic controversy. The Emperor Leo the Isaurian basically says that you can't have icons. You can't have any physical representation. And in part, this is because he's doing what on his frontiers? Who's he battling? The Muslims. And of course, in Islam, you can have no physical representations like that. That's why we get those great geometric, Islamic artworks. Iconoclasm becomes official imperial policy in the East. The Pope intervenes in what's called the Tome of Leo. No, strike that. That's a different council. I'm trying to remember what it's called. But at any rate, the Pope intervenes. The iconoclastic controversy is not a controversy about images. It's another Christological controversy. What the Eastern Church, what the Emperor is arguing in the Eastern Church is, since God is infinite and cannot be circumscribed, you can't have any picture of him. So a picture of Jesus, since he's part of the infinite Godhead, you can't have a picture of him. No icons. This is resolved on formal theological grounds that the prosopon of the Godhead, Jesus, the face, is how God has chosen to reveal himself in a particular time and place, and that this does not circumscribe the Godhead in any way. And so there's a lot of back and forth over that, and you start getting images back. But the point is that, again, this is another issue why the Eastern Church is split. They're fighting with each other, both over monophysitism and over other Christological controversies that present themselves as issues over icons. Now, this seems to be a particularly rich vein of the Greek language. Greek is just great for arguing over this stuff. Latin is a little bit more black and white. There's a lot of gray in Greek, which is maybe why you see these arguments more in the East. But also, it is an empire under more direct attack. Constantinople is under siege how many times, right? How many battles are happening in the Mideast as Muslim armies advance? It's a big deal. Iconoclasm is imperial policy in the East. But the Pope in the West is saying, we can have pictures, we can have statues, we can, and so 741 is the last election of a Pope in which the Emperor gives formal confirmation. That's pretty early when you consider what's going to happen over the next couple centuries in the West as power now shifts north of the Alps. And it's basically a phenomenon secondary to Muslim aggression.
Is this when you say the Eastern Church, you're talking about the Eastern Church splitting from Eastern Church to what?
Well, there's still one church, but there are power centers between the Western Church, which has now evolved to be principally in Latin, and the Eastern Church, which is principally in Greek, with its archbishops or patriarchs being in Constantinople, in what's now Istanbul, in Antioch, Syria, and in Alexandria, Egypt, which is still principally a Greek city. Just the fact that you have those different groups there means you're going to have some jockeying. And then Alexandria falls early to the Muslim armies. And so you don't have a patriarch in Alexandria anymore. Then Antioch falls. You don't have a patriarch in Antioch. Constantinople, which is asserted ecumenical authority as the ecumenical, patriarch, becomes the de facto patriarch in the East. But while that's all happening, people in the Eastern Church are still fighting with each other over theological issues, complicated by the emperor's fight with the Muslims and how it would be a lot easier for the emperor if we did away with these images. Then the people on my frontiers I can, keep from converting to Islam because we don't have images either. Again, you're never going to find purity of motive in any of these things, right? So, what happens in the meantime? Well, we're on, slide 16 now? Now we get another theological controversy thrown into the mix. This is the filioque clause, which originally arises in the 5th century at the Council of Toledo, or the Synod of Toledo, not the Council, and shows up in the Athanasian Creed. Now, there should be still prayer books around from this morning. Turn with me in your prayer books to, let me find it, to page 864. And what you'll find there at the top of the page is the Christological formulation of the Council of Chalcedon. But at the bottom of the page you get Quincunque Vult, the Creed of St. Athanasius. I have been a member of 2 different parishes that use this on the Feast of the Holy Trinity. It's pretty rare anymore. Particularly if you chant it, this becomes death by plain song. But this is the most elaborate creed you will find, and it is normative still in some areas of not the Episcopal Church, but you've got the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. Now the Apostles' Creed's pretty basic. Then you get the Nicene Creed is a lot more elaborate. Why? Because it's responding to questions raised about the Apostles' Creed. Then you get the Athanasian Creed, which is even more elaborate. The Athanasian Creed includes the filioque clause. Now, if you turn with me in your prayer books to page 358, I think it is. Yes, 358. If you turn to the Nicene Creed there and look at page 359, it says, "We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Qui ex patre filioque procedit in Latin, okay? That is considered to be a theological innovation in the East, where the doctrine is that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. This is the issue of single or double procession. Now, you can make good arguments about double procession. For example, Jesus breathing on the apostles in the upper room and saying, receive the Holy Spirit. But certainly how we receive the Holy Spirit is actually, I'm going off on a tangent there. That's not a good argument, because that's not how the Holy Spirit arises, okay? That's how we would receive the Holy Spirit, in the upper room or at Pentecost. The issue in the Eastern Church has always been that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father. The Western Church in the Filioque clause says that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. The Eastern Church objects to this on theological grounds, but formally objects to this on the ground that it has never been subject to an ecumenical council, and you can't change the creed without calling and, having a real ecumenical council. Canonically, the Eastern Church is correct. You can't have a change in the creed without an ecumenical council. This is why, when the Archbishop of Canterbury has been consecrated the last 2 times that I'm aware of at any rate, there have been representatives of the Eastern Patriarchs present, and they've used the Nicene Creed without the Filioque clause. Because you can still make the theological arguments about this, but they're saying we will recognize the ecumenical nature of the Church and use the creed in the form that was in existence before, because there was no council. So formally speaking, the East is right on this one. Theologically, we can get into a whole different set of arguments over single or double procession. But at any rate, it becomes a big deal. The use of the clause is opposed in the East by the Patriarch Paul II, who, because he opposes it, is excommunicated by the Pope. In 798, we start seeing the practice of chanting the creed in the Eucharistic liturgy being adopted in the court of Charlemagne, and this spreads throughout the Western Rite. It becomes normative to use the creed at Eucharist in the West. It is not yet in the East. And so the use of the clause, the Filioque clause, becomes a Western feature. Controversies continue, go figure. The Emperor Henry II insists on the use of the creed with the Filioque clause at his coronation in Rome in 1014. And since that time, the clause has been used throughout Western Eucharistic liturgies. By 1053, the Greek language churches in Italy are required to use the clause or shut down. The Patriarch in Constantinople, in response, closes all Latin Rite churches in the East. Now, this is obviously building up the body, right? And then in 1054, mutual anathemas are issued. What does anathema mean? It means that you are considered an abomination, and it's actually a verb. Anathema means let him be considered exiled, an abomination. Let him be considered cursed. It's an imperative verb, anathema in Greek. These mutual anathemas are lifted in 1965 when Paul VI visits the Patriarch in Constantinople. Beginning in the 90s, whenever the Pope and the Patriarch have met, they have recited the creed in Greek and omitted the clause. The effect of this schism, this is what is called the Great Schism, okay? And the effect on the English church is to cement English churchmanship and practice solidly in the Western sphere of influence. No more any arguments about what's happening in the East. We're doing it this way, right? This is, again, a consolidation of power going on. And so we end up here with, at 1054, what Europe looks like. And everything in orange is Catholic. Everything in blue is Eastern Orthodox. And then you see some striped areas here where you've still got some pagans running around in the east in that gray area. And then you see that little set of purple stripes sort of going across, the Balkans. And these are the Bogomils, who are sort of a Gnostic sect. They're not really Christians. And so that's the way Europe looks at the Great Schism. When we meet again next month, we're going to talk a lot more about the rise of the church in England as an independent entity that way. But we've got 20 minutes left today, and we first want to talk about questions, but then we also, without making anybody read their paper, want to talk about the question that our students were asked. But let's talk about questions first. Marianne.
The separation of the Eastern Church, the Greek Church,
Mm-hmm.
and the Catholic Church, as we have it here. This is, excuse me, this is what you've been talking about, right?
Yes.
This is why it happened.
Well, there were a lot of factors that we've covered here in terms of things like all of the where are settings on it? I'll deal with that later. We've talked about power politics going on and how rivalries come out on that basis. We've talked about splits in the East as a result of Muslim invasion. We've talked about the consolidation of power north of the Alps because of what's happening in the Mediterranean. These are just all forces that are pulling East and West apart. Where they start is differences in language between Greek and Latin.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. This is, if we try to look just at the Nicene Creed and say that the Son is begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of the same being as the Father. And so in Greek we would say homoousios, of the same being, of the same ousios. This gets translated into Latin as consubstantialum, but substantia in philosophy is not the same thing as ousios in philosophy. It's a different thing, reflecting some slight differences between Aristotelian philosophy and Platonic or Neoplatonic theology. And so you start seeing people understanding what they're saying differently because of the differences in the language. And the Eastern Church evolves into something in which things are a little bit more speculative and mystical in some ways. And so the doctrine of deification is very important in the Eastern Church, that we become more Christ-like, that we can eventually become in union with God. The doctrine in the Western Church is much more sort of based on the Latin legal code of, if you've got an overlord and you offend your overlord, you've got to make satisfaction for that. It becomes more penal. That gets formalized in Anselm's Cur Deus Homo. Language is, we experience reality through language, consciousness through language. So if we describe things differently, they're different. And this is what happens between Greek and Latin, and the church starts experiencing things differently, which means we have an awful lot to learn from each other. So, other questions?
There's so much talk of the leadership, but what are the records, or are there records that talk about the people? How were they doing with all these changes? They were missionaries coming and all this stuff.
We have almost no record of that. Any record you would have would be written by the missionary saying what happened when I showed up. But you're not going to generally get somebody else saying what happened because this is a pre-literate age. The people who can read and write are priests and monks. That's it.
I was thinking about it because as
It didn't have a bridge. This is, very much something that you show up, here's your duty, and you have to get it done at a certain time of year, and that's the deal. And so, if you go to Britain, you would still find what's called a tithe barn, because, here's where you store the tithe of your crop that is the church's. People aren't paying taxes so much in money. We live in an era that, it's actually postmodern more than modern, but the rise of the modern world in the 15th and 16th century is a revolution in thought, how we look at reality. If you go back to that C.S. Lewis book I talked about, the world is a very different world in classical and medieval thinking. There are ways that, you're influenced by the moving spheres above you, Now, that can take a very unhealthy and occult turn like astrology, but in a formal Christian context in a prior culture, it's saying how God's involved, and how he mediates his action to you. Now, the question we asked was to go back to cultural legacies, right? And a lot of what we've talked about in this class particularly, a little bit the others, is how culture is playing into the development not only of doctrine, but of institutions. So let's fast forward to 2017 in southeastern Wisconsin. And what about, without looking at your papers here, what would you call out as a cultural development that is having an effect on the development of doctrine and structure in the Episcopal Church? Let's just narrow it down to the Episcopal Church. Gay marriage, right? The law of the land of the king, or the sovereign that way, has changed. And the sovereign has said, this is a legal union to be recognized in all states of the nation, and you can't, make a distinction on that basis. Does church law recognize that?
No.
Well, the Episcopal Church has adopted a canon that says that the union between two people of the same sex can be solemnized in church. And that this can happen if your bishop, your ordinary, permits it. And then the church has gone on to develop a rite for this. But it's not part of the Book of Common Prayer.
In RITE.
Right, R-I-T-E, yes. It's not part of the Book of Common Prayer. So formally, under the Constitution and canons of the Church, it is not an official rite of the Church. It is an alternate rite. Now, the prayer book already says that no cleric may be compelled to preside over any marriage. So whether it's, straight people or gay people, any priest can say, I'm not doing it. But would the Episcopal Church have adopted that canon if there had not been a major movement in the culture in the last 25 years to recognize same-sex unions? Probably not, at least not yet. And so we're seeing a push-pull between doctrine and culture. What other things? Women's ordination, right? Arguing for keeping them barefoot and pregnant is not going to get a lot of currency in the developed West. But we've only had female priests for how long now? 42 years. And so there's nobody in the room who, has been, I think we're all in our 40s or over, We've always lived in a church in which there have been female priests. Now, we may not have lived in a diocese in which there was a female priest until when? 2003 or something in Fond du Lac. Maybe a little earlier, 2002 it might have been. But that's been the norm for a while. We now are to the point where if you look at the number of ordinands in the Episcopal Church nationally, there are more women being ordained than men. And pretty soon, within 5-6 years, the majority of clergy in most dioceses will be female. Now, without overgeneralizing too much here, the last time I checked, there are differences between men and women. And having any organization in which there are a majority of women in leadership changes the place, right? Just, we're in the midst of that change. We're just part of that change. What else will we point to in culture?
DACA. I mean, maybe not as much here, but in some parishes, how you respond to someone who's an illegal immigrant.
Mm-hmm. Sure. DACA is what she's talking about. And so how we respond to an undocumented alien living in our midst? Do we give them sanctuary and say we'll resist the federal government? Do we sit there and they say they're illegal aliens and kick them out? I mean, if we succeeded in rounding up every person without work papers in Wisconsin, what would be the first thing we'd have to do? Shut down all the dairies. And shut down all the meatpacking plants. You know, I mean, we have a source of labor now. Again, going back to, this is on the web, let me be careful here. I am not equating any immigrants with barbarians, okay? I'm talking about the migration of peoples. But if we go back to the barbarian invasions, you know, these are mainly economic, right? Where you're going where there's food, you're going where there's land, you're going, you know, where there's opportunity. And these are not tides that are resistible unless you, you know, not only build a wall, but start, I don't know, killing people or something like that. And so the idea that you're going to sit there and draw a line around something and say it's the Danube River and we're going to keep the barbarians over there because we've got the Roman army. See how that worked out? But how does the church respond is, again, we're responding to an issue in the culture around us. What else would we point to today that hasn't really happened yet that looks like a trend line and we're going to have to do something about?
Not so many people coming to church.
Right. You know, we see a change in, you know, we have institutional churches that are based on structure, place, giving. In an increasingly digital age, far fewer people are reading. What's one thing you no, I'm not saying that these people are illiterate, but what's one thing you have to do to be an Anglican? You got to be able to read, right? It's a book-based practice. And so either you got to, you know, figure out how to do it with big screens, or you do it just in sort of call and response sort of thing, and you change your liturgy. There are a lot of things. Does this mean the liturgy is invalid and Jesus doesn't show up at the altar? No. But in the meantime, your church is changing around you. And we see lots of efforts by lots of churches to say, let's hold the line.
Well, for example?
What would happen if tomorrow you were to walk into Grace Episcopal Church and partly obscuring the rood screen, but on either side up there were two big video screens, and the service was on those, and there were no mass booklets, and you were just supposed to sing along, and, you know, there'd be a reaction of some kind, right? Now, would that mean that that service was invalid if we use the proper words of institution and bread and wine? No. But experiencing change like that is traumatic.
Yes.
And if we just go back, we're in 2018. If we go back 10 years, 2008, we had a liberal president saying that marriage was a sacred institution between a man and a woman. Within 10 years, that's changed. That's the blink of an eye in the evolution of culture. The problem we have is the change is so rapid, if people are upset by it or mourn it or whatever, they're not getting an opportunity to mourn it. And so the first reaction that happens when you can't formally process grief is what? You get angry. or you get depressed, or both. And so the kind of culture wars we're seeing now are probably, in part, a reflection over the fact that things are happening so fast that we're not getting to process them. I mean, this is within one generation. If it was multiple generations to make a change like that, you know, everybody has gay family members, everybody knows a gay person, that sort of thing. That was the sort of pace of change before. Now it's judicial fiat, and people are reacting to that, inside and outside of the church. Could be immigration. It could be women's ordination. It could be a whole bunch of things. But cultural changes are always going to push at the development of doctrine, and cultural changes are always going to push at how the institution is structured. If we were to find, as we had in this church in the 1980s, a couple hundred refugees dropped on us who happened to be pagans and happened to not speak English, it would change who we are depending on how we react to that. If we said, these people are not, we don't want to deal with them, that would immediately change what kind of church we are, right?
When the monkey, we did have that, and this church was heavily involved.
That's what I'm saying. And it changed who Grace Church was. If Grace Church had said in the 80s, we don't want to deal with those people, it would be a different church now. And so if there had ever been any successful refugee program for people from Syria, Deacon Mike was exploring how we could work with the national councils on that. And, the idea was to, settle 50 Syrians here, from Raqqa or something, and have them in Grace Episcopal Church. And we were going to try to get the building across the street before it was bought by the Founders Club. Huh?
That happened here?
Didn't happen because the federal government never really executed a refugee program to bring in people from Syria.
Oh, okay.
That would have changed who we are right now, right? Incidentally, if you go back and look at the boat people coming in the 1970s, right now we have formal litigation between the United States Department of Justice and the state of California, with people saying they're at war with each other, using that word. And it's because California is saying we're going to be a sanctuary state and we won't cooperate with the federal government on immigration. What happened in 1975? California actively resisted the federal government bringing in the boat people, tried to prevent planes from landing, had decrees from the governor, who's the governor again, Jerry Brown, saying these people can't settle here. Why? Because they had an unemployment problem. And so if you go back, 40 years ago and see how California reacted to immigration, it's 180 degrees apart. And so I'm going to close on that point by saying, that while cultural forces and issues have a push-pull on doctrine and on institutions, again, there are no purities in motives. California was arguing in the 70s from an economic motive. Probably some other motives too, but certainly from an economic motive. California is now arguing from a different motive. And so whatever argument we make on issues relevant to the culture, whether it's gay rights or women or, changes in the liturgy, they're never going to, we always claim a mantle of purity to say, we're the faithful remnant, the righteous remnant, right? And we're going to do it this way. And just as in most things, you kind of follow the money, and you say, whose ox is getting gored? On that note, we're going to default to this table, because these people are formally in the process, and they can pick, but whoever picks, the next one goes next time. Close us in prayer.
Lord, thank you for bringing us together today. Thank you for giving Father Carl this wisdom to share with us. Help open our minds and our hearts so that we can process it, because it's a lot to learn. And help Lisa and I in our journey toward you. Keep us close to you. And to also bless the people in the room. Thank you for all the blessings in life.
Amen. I will get back to you about your papers in the next day or two.